The lie had a smell. For 40 years, I thought it was the scent of our life. Richard's old leather armchair, lemon polish on the oak floors, and the faint, sweet perfume of the rose bushes he tended with such devotion. But that afternoon, as the rain drummed a somber rhythm on the attic roof, I found the source of the rot, and I realized the smell wasn't love. It was decay. It was all packed away in a dusty trunk, hidden beneath a christening gown yellowed with age and a stack of my daughter Sarah's kindergarten drawings, still vibrant with the innocent certainty of a 5-year-old. It was a slender tube of black leather, cold and stiff to the touch. My fingers, wrinkled with 60 years of life, trembled as I slid out the rolled parchment. Eleanor Vance, Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry. Magnesium Laud. The university seal was embossed in gold, still gleaming faintly in the dim, dusty light. I didn't feel a flicker of pride. I felt a sudden, sharp stab of terror, a cold dread that coiled in my stomach like a snake. This piece of paper wasn't a memory. It was an accusation. Comment on which city you're watching and subscribe to the channel because I guarantee there's more to this story than meets the eye. I carried it downstairs, the parchment held away from my body as if it were contaminated, a relic from a tomb I didn't know I occupied. Richard was in his armchair, the reading lamp pooling around him, illuminating the silver in his hair, making him look like a saint in a Renaissance painting. He looked up as I entered, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, and smiled. It was the same gentle, crinkling smile he'd given me every day for 4 decades, a smile that had always felt like coming home. "Find anything interesting up there, Ellie?" he asked, his voice a low, comforting rumble that had soothed every fear I'd ever had. Or so I had thought. I held out the diploma. The smile vanished from his face. It didn't just fade, it was wiped clean, violently erased, replaced by a tight, gray mask of apprehension I had never seen before. His whole body went rigid. "Oh," he said, his voice suddenly thin and reedy, all the warmth gone. "That old thing. I thought we'd thrown that out years ago." He folded his newspaper with sharp, angry, definitive movements, creasing it into a weapon. "Put it back, Eleanor. There's no point in dredging up the past." Dredging up the past? It was my past. It was a life I had apparently lived, a degree I had earned with the highest honors, and I had absolutely no emotional connection to it. It felt like holding the photograph of a stranger's child. My daughter, Sarah, came in then, a cheerful whirlwind in the sudden frost of the room, bringing me a cup of tea. She was a good daughter, always so attentive, so pathologically concerned. She saw the diploma clutched in my hand and the thundercloud on her father's face. "Mom? What's that?" she asked, her brow furrowing with the same manufactured worry I was so used to, a look she had perfected over years of treating me like delicate china. I told her, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. She placed the tea on the coaster with an overly careful hand and gave me a soft, pitying look, the kind one gives to a confused patient. "Oh, Mom. Dad's right. Why upset yourself over this? You were so fragile back then. Everyone agreed you made the right choice to leave all that behind." They spoke of my life as if it were a closed case, a story written and finished by someone else, a book they had both read and decided to shelve. But for the first time, holding the tangible proof of a different me in my hands, I felt the desperate urge to rip the book open and read the missing pages. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they weren't protecting me from my past. They were hiding it. The diploma sat on the mantelpiece, an unwelcome guest at the feast of our quiet, carefully curated life. Richard refused to look at it, his gaze sliding past it as if it were a hole in the fabric of our reality. Sarah would glance at it and then quickly away as if its presence were a breach of etiquette, an unpleasant topic brought up at a dinner party. For me, it was a silent taunt. Magnesium Laud. The Latin words echoed in a hollow part of my mind, a chamber that had been sealed off for decades. What had happened to the woman who earned them? The official story, the one that had been the bedrock of my identity for 40 years, was simple, and they had told it to me so many times I had come to believe I remembered it myself. I had been a bright but overly sensitive, high-strung student. The pressure of my final year, the looming expectation of a brilliant career, became too much. I had a nervous breakdown, a delicate shattering of the mind, and Richard, my devoted young boyfriend, had rescued me from the wreckage. He'd nursed me back to a quiet stability, and we had chosen a simpler, safer path together. Marriage, a home, a child. I became a homemaker, a wife, a mother. It was, I was told, a life I had chosen out of necessity, a retreat from a world that was too loud, too bright, too harsh for my fragile temperament. But the diploma didn't feel fragile. The ink was bold, the paper thick with importance. It felt powerful. A few nights after I found it, I woke up in a cold sweat, my nightgown clinging to my skin. A dream, vivid and unsettling, was slipping through the sieve of my consciousness. The smell of ozone and something sharp, like isopropyl alcohol. The aggressive glint of fluorescent lights on rows of glass beakers. A man's voice, deep and resonant, not Richard's, saying, "You're on the cusp of it, Eleanor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Richard was snoring softly beside me, a picture of domestic peace, utterly oblivious. I crept out of the room, a ghost in my own house, and went downstairs. The house was dark and silent, but the diploma on the mantel seemed to catch the moonlight, glowing with a life of its own. I ran my fingers over my name, tracing the letters. Eleanor Vance. Not Eleanor Peterson. Vance. It was the name of a ghost, and I was beginning to suspect I was haunting my own life. The next day, I started digging. I told Richard I was finally organizing the old photo albums, a domestic task he could understand and approve of. It was a lie, the first of many I would soon learn to tell with unnerving ease. The attic became my sanctuary, my archaeological dig site. I wasn't just looking for things. I was looking for a person. I found a heavy cardboard box I'd never seen before, tucked away in a dark corner behind a broken rocking horse. It was filled with my old college things, things I hadn't known existed. Textbooks with intimidating titles like Principles of Cellular Respiration and Advanced Organic Chemistry. The pages were filled with my handwriting, a neat, confident, almost aggressive script that was nothing like the shaky, looping cursive I used for grocery lists now. My notes were intricate, full of complex diagrams and challenging questions scrawled in the margins. This wasn't the work of a fragile mind on the verge of collapse. This was the work of a mind that was on fire. Tucked inside a copy of The Molecular Biology of the Cell was a faded photograph. It was of me, but not me, a young woman with fierce, intelligent eyes, dark hair pulled back in a messy but practical ponytail, and a confident, almost cocky smile stood beside a handsome, silver-haired man in a lab coat. He had an arm around my shoulder in a way that looked both paternal and proprietary. We were both grinning, holding up a small petri dish to the camera as if it were the Holy Grail. On the back, in my own lost handwriting, it said, "Dr. Finch and me. The day we finally stabilized the protein sequence. June 1983. The future is bright. Dr. Finch." The name from my dream. Alistair Finch. I remembered him now, in flashes like lightning strikes in a darkroom. His passion for science was infectious, brilliant, and all-consuming. He saw something in me, a spark he fanned into a roaring flame. He called me his star pupil, his protege. Why had I never spoken his name in 40 years? Why did Richard, who knew everyone in my college life, never, ever mention him? The questions began to pile up, forming a silent, invisible wall between me and the life I knew. I decided to test the wall. I asked Richard about Dr. Finch one evening, trying to sound casual as I passed him the salt at the dinner table. "Honey, do you remember a professor of mine, a Dr. Finch? From the biochemistry department?" Richard's fork clattered against his plate, a sound magnified in the sudden quiet. He took a slow sip of water, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, a long, calculated pause. "Vaguely," he said, his voice carefully neutral, scraped clean of any emotion. "A bit of an arrogant fellow, as I recall. Pushed his students too hard, filled your head with all sorts of nonsense about a career. You were better off without that kind of influence." The dismissal was too quick, too neat, too final. It was another door slamming shut in my face, and this time I heard the lock turn. I knew then I couldn't rely on him, or on Sarah. When I mentioned Dr. Finch to her on the phone the next day, her response was a rehearsed, perfect echo of her father's. "Mom, please. We've been over this. Those people, that whole environment, it wasn't good for you." It put too much pressure on you. Dad did what was best. The way she said it, what was best, sounded like a line from a script she had been fed her whole life. They were a united front, the guardians of a story I was no longer sure I believed. My house, once my haven, began to feel like a beautifully decorated prison. Every polished surface seemed to reflect a distorted version of me, a woman I didn't recognize. The faint, sweet scent of roses from the garden started to smell cloying, heavy, like funeral flowers. My investigation became more desperate, more furtive. I used the old, slow laptop Sarah had bought me for my birthday, my fingers fumbling on the keys like a clumsy burglar. I typed Alistair Finch, biochemist, into the search bar. The results hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. Dr. Alistair Finch was a titan in his field. He was the head of the prestigious Finch-Peterson Research Institute, with dozens of lucrative patents to his name and articles in every major scientific journal. His official biography mentioned his groundbreaking early work in protein synthesis at my old university, work that had laid the foundation for his entire celebrated career. There was no mention of a star pupil named Eleanor Vance. It was as if I had been meticulously scrubbed from the record, an inconvenient detail photoshopped out of history. This was no longer just about a forgotten diploma. This was about an erased life. I felt a surge of pure, hot, cleansing anger that burned away the fog of confusion and grief. They had called me fragile, delicate, unstable. But the woman who filled those notebooks with brilliant, incisive observations wasn't fragile. She was a force. And someone had snuffed her out. I looked at my reflection in the dark computer screen. The face looking back was tired, lined, and sad. But for the first time in a long, long time, behind the sadness, I saw a flicker of the old fire. The ghost of Eleanor Vance was starting to wake up, and she was demanding answers. The digital trail led me to an obscure online alumni forum for my graduating class, or what should have been my graduating class. I posted a tentative message, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. Does anyone remember a biochemistry student named Eleanor Vance from the class of '83? We worked in Dr. Finch's lab. For days, there was only silence. I checked the page obsessively, the quiet hum of the computer a mocking sound. The hope drained out of me with each empty refresh. I started to believe them. Maybe I really did just fade away, a non-entity, a footnote in no one's memory. Then, one morning, there was a notification. A private message. The sender's name was Maria Suarez, my lab partner. I remember you, Eleanor, the message read. Of course, I remember you. We all thought you were going to win a Nobel Prize someday. Then you just disappeared. Vanished. We heard there was an accident. An accident. The word hung in the digital space, heavy and menacing. It was a new piece of the puzzle, a jagged edge that didn't fit with the smooth, polished narrative of a simple nervous breakdown. I wrote back immediately, my hands shaking so much I could barely type. Maria, what accident? No one ever told me about an accident. They told me I just couldn't cope. Her reply came within the hour. It was longer this time, more detailed, a flood of memory from a past I didn't have. It was all very hush-hush. There was a fire in our research lab late one night, right before finals. The story the university put out was that you'd been working while exhausted, pushed yourself too hard, and made a catastrophic error with the reagents. They said you were lucky to not have been hurt. Your research, that special project you were working on with Finch, the protein synthesis stuff, it was completely destroyed. Gone. The official word was that you had a total breakdown from the guilt and withdrew for medical reasons. Your boyfriend, Richard, he handled everything. We were all so shocked. It didn't sound like you at all. You were the most meticulous person in the lab. A fire. A lab. Destroyed research. The vague, nightmarish fragments in my mind began to coalesce, drawn together by the gravity of her words. The smell of smoke. The sound of shattering glass. A wave of nausea and a crushing, baseless guilt washed over me. Had I done that? Could I have been responsible for destroying my own future? The story was plausible, fitting neatly into the fragile Eleanor narrative that Richard and Sarah so carefully maintained. It would explain the guilt, the shame, the reason my mind might have buried the trauma so deep. But Maria's last few sentences planted a seed of doubt that began to sprout, its thorny vines strangling the guilt. The weirdest part, she wrote, was Dr. Finch. He was your biggest champion. He told everyone you were the most promising student he'd ever had. We all expected him to defend you, to fight for you. But he didn't. He corroborated the university's story. In fact, he was the one who signed the official report on your negligence. After that, his career took off like a rocket. The university gave him a huge grant. It never sat right with any of us. The betrayal was so sharp, so specific, it took my breath away. Dr. Finch, the man whose voice in my dream had told me I was on the cusp of something great, had signed my professional death warrant. And Richard. Where was Richard in all of this? I scrolled back through the hazy photo album of my memories, trying to place him in the timeline. He was always there, on the periphery of my academic life, a handsome, patient boyfriend waiting for me to finish my hobby. I remembered now how much he disliked the long hours I spent in the lab. He was jealous of Dr. Finch. I could see that now with painful clarity. He'd called him a stuffed shirt and complained that I talked more about protein sequences than about our future together. I decided to call the university's records office. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I gave them my name and student number, which I'd found on an old, laminated ID card in the trunk. The woman on the other end of the line was pleasant but firm, a bureaucratic gatekeeper. I see your file, Mrs. Peterson. It says here you withdrew for disciplinary reasons following an internal review. Disciplinary reasons. Not medical. Disciplinary. That was a word for punishment. For blame. For a crime. Could I get a copy of that review? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I'm afraid not, she said coolly, the pleasantness gone. Those records are sealed. Sealed. Another locked door. But they had made a mistake. They had told me it was a disciplinary action. And that meant there had to be a file. A report. The one Dr. Finch had signed. That evening, the tension in our house was thick enough to cut with a knife. I stared at Richard across the dinner table, at the handsome, familiar face of the man I had slept beside for 40 years, and I saw a complete stranger. I saw the handsome young man who was jealous of my ambition. I saw the husband who gently, lovingly, steered me away from any topic that grazed the raw edges of my past. Every act of kindness, every protective gesture I had cherished over the decades, now seemed sinister, suspect. Was his care for me genuine, or was it the careful tending of a jailer polishing the bars of a beautiful cage? Richard, I said, my voice shocking me with its steadiness, betraying none of the seismic turmoil inside me. I spoke to an old college friend today. Maria Suarez. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just apprehension. Pure, unadulterated fear. She told me there was a fire in my lab. He put his fork down slowly, deliberately. The silence in the room stretched, filled only by the solemn, judgmental ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of our life, of our lie. It was a small fire, Eleanor. A minor incident, he said, his words clipped and precise. You were overwrought. You were exhausted. You mixed the wrong chemicals. You were lucky you weren't killed. I got you out of there. I took you home. I saved you. He said it with such conviction, with the righteous indignation of a hero who has been unjustly questioned. You saved me? I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Or you buried me? His face hardened. The gentle, loving husband was gone, replaced by a cold, defensive stranger. I gave you a good life. A beautiful daughter, a safe home. That brilliant career you were chasing would have chewed you up and spit you out. You weren't built for it. I gave you peace. You never gave me a choice, I whispered, the realization a physical blow. You just gave me a story. I stood up from the table, my dinner untouched. I looked at the diploma on the mantelpiece, then back at him, at the ruins of our shared history. I'm going back to the university, Richard. I'm going to unseal those records. I didn't wait for his reply. I walked out of the room, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt the lock on my own mind begin to turn. The truth was in that sealed file, and I was going to get it, no matter what it cost me. Subscribe now, you won't believe the twist that's coming. The drive to the university was a pilgrimage into a past I was only just beginning to own. The campus had changed, of course. New buildings with sleek, impersonal glass walls stood beside the old ivy-covered brick halls I vaguely remembered. It was both achingly familiar and profoundly alien, like visiting the landscape of a dream. I had made an appointment, not with the records office, but with the university's legal counsel. I had spent 2 sleepless nights preparing, my laptop glowing in the dark as I read up on student privacy laws and academic grievance procedures. I was no longer the docile, confused woman from a week ago. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was armed with a righteous fury that felt like a long-lost limb reawakening. I sat in a sterile, beige waiting room, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. I had lied to Richard again, telling him I was going to a book club meeting in the city. The ease with which the lie came scared me. How many lies had I been living with, unknowingly, for all these years? Sarah had called that morning, her voice laced with that infuriating, condescending concern that now felt like a razor blade. "Dad told me you're getting all worked up about this college stuff again, Mom. Please, just let it go. It's for your own good. We're worried about you." I had hung up on her, the click of the phone a small, sharp act of rebellion. The bond between us, once the central pillar of my life, now felt like another chain. A young, sharp-suited lawyer, a woman named Ms. Davis, finally called me in. She was professional, her eyes assessing me with a mixture of pity and institutional wariness. I stated my case calmly and clearly, my voice even, my resolve like iron. I told her I believed the official story of my withdrawal was a fabrication to cover up something else entirely. I told her I had reason to believe the accident in the lab was not my fault and that the disciplinary action was unjust. I wanted to see the file. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, designed to placate and dismiss, "those files are from 40 years ago and are sealed by a non-disclosure agreement signed at the time. To unseal them would require a compelling reason, perhaps even a court order." I leaned forward, my eyes locking with hers, channeling the ghost of the woman who earned that diploma. "My entire life was built on what's in that file," I said, my voice low and intense. "A lie was told. My reputation was destroyed, and my future was stolen. I think that's a pretty compelling reason. And for the record, my name at the time was Vance. Perhaps it was the fire in my eyes or the mention of a potential lawsuit hanging unspoken in the air." She stared at me for a long moment, the professional mask slipping just a fraction. Then she sighed, a small puff of defeat. "Wait here," she said, and left the room. The 20 minutes I waited were the longest of my life. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. What would I find? Proof of my own failure? Or proof of a betrayal so deep, so foundational, it would unravel everything? "Ms. Davis returned carrying a single, thin manila folder, yellowed with age, its edges brittle. It felt heavier than a tombstone. She placed it on the desk between us with a distinct lack of warmth. "This is highly unusual," she warned. "The university admits no wrongdoing. This is a courtesy." I knew it wasn't a courtesy. It was a calculation. They were betting the contents would shut me up, not spur me on. I opened the folder. The first page was the official incident report. It detailed a small chemical fire in Lab 3B on the night of June 2, 1983. It listed the cause as procedural negligence by student Eleanor Vance. It described me as emotionally overwrought and working under extreme self-imposed pressure. Then I saw the signature at the bottom, the one that confirmed the story Maria had told me. It was crisp and clear, an elegant, arrogant script. Dr. Alistair Finch. My breath hitched. He had signed it, but there was something else tucked behind the main report. A second, shorter statement, a witness account typed on a different machine. My eyes scanned the page, and then I saw the name of the witness, and the world tilted violently on its axis. The statement was given by Richard Peterson. My Richard. His statement was brief, just a few devastating sentences. He claimed he had come to the lab that night, worried about my long hours and fragile state. He said he found me crying, surrounded by broken beakers, a small fire smoldering in a wastebasket. He claimed I confessed to him that I had ruined everything, and that I couldn't handle the pressure anymore. He was the sole witness. His story was the foundation for the entire official narrative. He hadn't just saved me from the fire. He had built the pyre, lit the match, and then played the hero who pulled me from the flames he himself had fanned. But there was one more document in the file, stapled to the very back, almost an afterthought. It was a carbon copy of a financial agreement. A donation. A very, very large donation made to the university's biochemistry department by Richard's father, a wealthy and influential man I had always found intimidating. The donation was dated June 10, 1983, 8 days after the fire. It was earmarked for a new research wing, a wing to be headed by the newly tenured associate professor, Alistair Finch. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening, final sound of a coffin lid shutting. This wasn't just a story. It was a transaction. My future had been bought and sold. Dr. Finch got his tenure and his funding. The university got its new building. And Richard got me. He got the quiet, dependent, fragile wife he wanted, a woman stripped of her ambition, a woman who would never outshine him, a woman he could protect for the rest of his life. The lie wasn't a kindness. It was a cage he had built with his father's money and my mentor's ambition. I closed the folder, my hands steady now with a cold, terrifying calm. I finally knew the truth, or at least, I thought I did. The deepest, most twisted part of the betrayal was yet to come. I drove home in a daze, the thin folder on the passenger seat beside me like a venomous snake. The truth was a poison seeping backward through time, tainting every memory I had. Our wedding day, was his loving gaze just the pride of a collector admiring his prize? The birth of Sarah, was his joy in our daughter also a joy in forging another bar for my cage? Every "I love you," every anniversary gift, every comforting hug was now rewritten as an act of masterful manipulation. The grief was immense, a physical weight in my chest. I had lost my career, my identity. But what I was mourning now, on that silent drive, was the loss of my love story. It had all been a sham. The only real thing in it was my own ignorance. When I walked through the front door, they were waiting for me, a united front of deception. Richard stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask of authority. Sarah sat on the sofa, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap, her expression a painful mix of fear and defiance. They knew where I had been. The empty book club alibi had collapsed under the weight of my long absence. "You went there," Richard said. "It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. After I told you to let it go." I didn't answer. I walked to the heavy oak coffee table and placed the yellowed manila folder on its polished surface. I slid it towards them. It came to a stop in the center of the table, an exhibit in a trial that was 40 years overdue. "My name was Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. "She was brilliant. She was on the verge of something important. And you erased her." Sarah reached for the folder, her curiosity warring with her fear, but Richard stopped her with a sharp, angry gesture. He wouldn't look at it. He looked only at me, his eyes pleading, desperate to maintain control of the narrative. "Ellie, you have to understand. I did it because I loved you. I was terrified of losing you. Finch, that research, it was consuming you. It was going to take you away from me. You were obsessed. We would have fallen apart. Love?" The word came out as a strangled, bitter laugh. "You call this love? Sabotaging a person's life, their mind, their very sense of self? You didn't love me, Richard. You loved the idea of owning me. You were a coward, too weak to stand next to a strong woman, so you broke her legs and called it an act of protection." "That's not true," Sarah cried, jumping to her feet, her loyalty to her father absolute. Her face was tear-streaked. "Dad did what he had to do. You were unstable, Mom. You were falling apart. He told me the whole story when I was old enough to understand. He did it to save our family. He did it to save you. And that was it. That was the final, devastating blow. The betrayal wasn't just 40 years old. It was a living, breathing thing that he had passed down to our daughter like a genetic disease. He had poisoned her with a lie, making her an accomplice, a second jailer who smiled at me with my own eyes. He had stolen my past, and then he had used that theft to warp my daughter's love for me into condescending pity. My knees felt weak. I gripped the back of a wingback chair to steady myself. The whole structure of my life, the very foundation of my being as a wife and a mother, was built on sand, and the tide was finally, violently, coming in. The fire, I whispered, looking at Richard, needing to hear it from his own lips, the last nail in the coffin. Tell me about the fire. Richard's face crumpled. The anger and defensiveness dissolved, leaving behind the hollowed-out face of a guilty man whose sins had finally come home to roost. He sank into his armchair, the one that had always seemed like a throne of quiet authority, and now looked like a dock for the accused. It was an accident, he mumbled, his voice thick with a shame that was 4 decades old. The fire part. I just went there to talk to you. To beg you not to take the fellowship. You weren't there, but your research was all spread out. Your notes, Finch's notes. It was all about a fellowship in Switzerland. A 3-year postdoc. You hadn't even told me you'd applied. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with pathetic, self-serving tears. I was going to lose you, Ellie. I knew it. I got angry. I swept a bunch of your beakers off the counter. I just wanted to slow you down, to create a setback, to make you need me. But one of them had some kind of reactive agent in it. It spilled into a bin with some discarded papers. It just flared up. It was a small fire, I swear. I put it out in a minute with the extinguisher. But it was enough. The damage was done. It was my chance to build a new story for us. It was the confession I had been waiting for. The proof, the sabotage, the frame-up, the collaboration with Finch bought and paid for with his father's money. It was all there. I felt a strange, hollow victory. I had the truth. The story was complete. But as I looked at his pathetic, broken form, a final, terrible question surfaced, a detail that didn't fit, a loose thread in his confession. You said you went there to talk to me, but I wasn't there. No, he said, shaking his head, lost in his own memory of the crime. You had already gone home for the night. I checked. You weren't in the lab. A sheet of ice spread through my veins, so cold it burned. The hazy memories, the nightmares. They weren't just of the lab, of smoke and chemicals. There was another layer. A deeper, more personal horror that my mind had suppressed even more completely than the fire itself. The feelings of panic, of guilt, of shame. They weren't just about my work. I stared at Richard, but I was seeing another face. The handsome, encouraging, predatory face of Dr. Alistair Finch. I saw his private office, the door clicking shut. I saw the crystal glass of whiskey on his desk. I remembered the smell of it on his breath and the weight of his hand on my shoulder, a hand that was no longer paternal or professional. I remembered saying no, my voice small. I remembered the fear. Oh God, I breathed, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical impact, a memory unearthing itself in a violent rush. The story wasn't about the fire at all. The fire was just the cover-up. The real trauma, the real reason for my breakdown, the event that had shattered my mind and made me susceptible to Richard's pathetic, jealous lies had happened earlier that same night. In Finch's office. What is it, Ellie? What's wrong? Richard asked, his own petty drama forgotten in the face of my sudden, visceral terror. I looked at him, at my husband, my saboteur, my jailer. And in that moment, I understood the final, most twisted layer of the truth. He didn't know. He had no idea what Finch had done to me that night. He had stumbled in afterward, found the lab in disarray from my frantic flight from Finch's office, the knocked-over chair, my abandoned notebook, perhaps my own tears still hanging in the air, and in his jealous, insecure little mind, he had created his own narrative. He thought I was breaking down over the pressure of my work and the fellowship in Switzerland. He set his petty fire, a pathetic act of sabotage to keep his girlfriend from leaving him, thinking he was the great manipulator, the puppet master of my life. But he wasn't. He was just another pawn. The real villain had assaulted me, then accepted a bribe to call me unstable, and had walked away clean, with a fat donation and a stellar career built on the ashes of mine. The two of us had been left trapped in a prison of a completely different making. The diploma wasn't a symbol of a lost career. It was a tombstone marking the night my soul was stolen, first by my mentor and then, in a different way, by the man I loved. My collapse wasn't manufactured. It was real. They had just all gotten the reasons wrong. There was no screaming, no shouting. All the anger had been burned out of me, replaced by a vast, empty, desolate calm. The truth was so much uglier, so much more complex than the simple story of jealousy I had uncovered. It was a tapestry of interwoven betrayals. Finch's assault, Richard's sabotage, my father-in-law's money, the university's complicity, and my own daughter's unwitting indoctrination. They had all played their part in burying Eleanor Vance. I looked at Richard, weeping in his armchair over a 40-year-old crime that paled in comparison to the real one. I looked at Sarah, who was staring at me, her face a mask of utter confusion, finally sensing that the ground beneath her feet was not just shaking, but vaporizing. "Pack your things, Sarah," I said, my voice as flat and gray as a winter sky. "What? Mom, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling, looking to her father for a cue he was no longer capable of giving. "We're leaving," I said. It was not a request. It was a fact. I walked past them, up the stairs to the bedroom I had shared with a stranger for 4 decades. I took one suitcase from the top of the closet. I didn't pack memories or trinkets. I packed clothes, toiletries, my wallet, my car keys. I walked back downstairs. Richard was on his feet now, his face streaked with tears and utter confusion. "Ellie, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I can make it up to you." "Fix this?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity for this fool who thought he was a king. He had no idea what he had truly done, what broken thing he had taken and locked away 40 years ago. "You can't fix something you don't even understand, Richard." I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the diploma. I rolled it carefully and slid it back into its cold leather tube. This was mine. It represented the brilliant woman I had been and the survivor I was now forced to become. Sarah was standing by the door, a look of pure panic on her face as her world dissolved. "Mom, where are we going?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But we're not staying here." I walked out the front door without a backward glance. The scent of Richard's prize-winning roses hung in the humid evening air, and for the first time, I could clearly smell the rot and decay beneath the cloying perfume. Sarah followed me, stumbling, crying, but she followed. The bond wasn't entirely broken, but it would need to be rebuilt from scratch, on a new and terrible foundation of shared truth. We drove away from the house, from the life that had been a lie. There was no cathartic breakdown, no satisfying emotional explosion. There was only the quiet hum of the engine and the vast, terrifying, and liberating expanse of the open road ahead. My diploma lay on the seat between us, not a trophy, not an accusation, but a compass. It pointed not to a lost past, but to an unknown future. It's never too late to find out who you are, but sometimes you have to burn down the life you thought you knew just to see the path forward. At 60 years old, my journey was just beginning. Comment which part of the story left you speechless.